Hello, it's Tonstant Weader, back to review a memoir this time. And my cat is helping me. His name's Oscar. The book is called Good Friday on the Res. It's by Hugh Bunnell. And it's a memoir of his friendship with Rennell White Thunder, his time living on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and some of the events from his childhood and throughout his adulthood. It's organized around a day trip on Good Friday, 280 miles round trip from his hometown, Alliance, Nebraska, to Pine Ridge Reservation and back again. He stops along the way at, he stops for coffee, he stops at memorials, he stops every possible chance he can. And then he tells stories about that place and what it brings to mind in his personal history or in the history of the Oglala Sioux. And he also spends part of the day with his friend Vernell, who he went into business with years ago, raising bison, who now has White Thunder tours, which you can find on the web, where folks go stay in a B&B and get a tour on horseback around the Black Hills around Pine Ridge. And he was there living on Pine Ridge Reservation during the 1973 Wounded Knee occupation, which he seemed to support more or less. And he actually was supportive enough to bring food supplies, which he describes in a somewhat hair-raising tale. But this memoir actually, for me, illustrates sometimes the limits of white anti-racist allies and the different standards we have for white resistance to government policy and people of color resistance to government policy, because there's a murder, a bunch of drunks were driving around and bored and decided to beat an Indian to death and probably thought they might get away with it because, white people killing people of color and getting away with it is still common and was certainly more common in the 70s. And it's got a long history. So the American Indian movement organized to put pressure on the community to indict and to convict these killers. And the trial was held in Bunnell's hometown. His father covered it as a reporter. And he describes American Indian movement coming as a caravan of crazed radical Indians. So this is the crazed things they did. They asked for and had a meeting with the mayor. They asked for a meeting space where they could do an assembly, talk to the community, answer questions, and they rallied outside the courthouse during the trial, drumming drums. So very crazed. And to me, it seems illustrative of the problem we still have, which is the Tea Party can march around with rifles and burn the president in effigy and talk about the Tree of Liberty needing the blood of patriots, and everybody applauds them for being patriotic, concerned citizens who love America. And then Black Lives Matter can protest extrajudicial murder by the police, can protest that a taillight being out is a capital crime in this country. And they do it without guns, unarmed protesters, And they're compared to ISIS and called terrorists. Or we could make even more direct comparison to the Wounded Knee occupiers who went to jail, who were considered terrorists and radicals and were punished legally. Leonard Peltier's still in jail. He's the longest incarcerated political prisoner in the world now. And he's still in jail and probably will be in jail the rest of his life. And then we have here in Oregon the Malheur Wildlife Refuge occupation, which, unlike Wounded Knee, they weren't occupying their own territory and their own land. Those people didn't even live in Oregon. But they came here and they took over the refuge with violence, with guns and rifles and the threat of violence and intimidation. And they threatened law enforcement, they threatened local citizens, and they weren't welcome and they weren't invited, and no one wanted them there, and yet they were acquitted. And so here we have this monopoly on violence by white resistance that is pretty much accepted by far too many people, obviously. And so they're patriots. People of color are terrorists. and we have this writer who's talking about racism and systemic racism and how oppressive it is. And yet, when the Native Americans organize and take agency for themselves and aren't relying on compassion and empathy and maybe are not following the kumbaya hallmark acceptable ways people of color can protest rules written by white people, they're crazed. And it speaks to the limits of white allyship, I think. It's sad because I liked this book and I think he's a good storyteller. He just doesn't interrogate himself. He recognizes the racism in others, but is incapable of seeing how he sets this standard that this is how Indians get to protest. And he doesn't recognize that it's their choice. Anyway, the book is Good Friday on the Res by David Hugh Bunnell. Informative, interesting, and sometimes it's interesting for reasons other than the author's intent. And that's all for today. Bye.